Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for your patience. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Ashley Rose, and I am a bookseller and a co-host of our social justice book club here at East City Bookshop. During the week, I am also lucky enough to live the dream of being a middle school librarian here in DC. It is wonderful to be here with you all today. Thank you so much for being here in person, and for those of you tuning in onto the live stream if you are watching that way. We are so excited to welcome Lena Andrews for a discussion of her book, Valiant Women, The Extraordinary American Servicewomen Who Helped Win World War II. A groundbreaking new history of the role of American servicewomen in World War II, illuminating their forgotten yet essential contributions to the Allies' victory. Joining her in conversation is April Ryan. If you enjoyed tonight's event, you may also enjoy one of our events coming up as we round out the summer and head into fall. Additionally, we host 13 different book clubs here at East City Bookshop that run the gamut of topics and genres. If nonfiction is up your alley, you might want to consider checking out Stranger Than Fiction, the club, or our Social Justice Book Club, co-hosted by yours truly. You can check our website for more details. Before we dive into this exciting event and author introductions, some quick housekeeping details. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones. If you need a restroom tonight, they are located upstairs and past the register. More importantly, if you need to purchase tonight's book, you can also purchase a copy at the register. If you are tuning in virtually and experience any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat where my colleague is monitoring. And we will have a Q&A following the discussion. So here, if you are in person, you can raise your hand to ask a question in person, or if you are watching virtually, put it into the Q&A box on Zoom and we will ask it for you. And now we'll get to the good part. So I'd love to welcome out our conversation partner and our author. Come on out. So today we are joined by Lena Andrews to discuss her new book, Valiant Women. This highly devourable, exquisitely researched book is the story of the 350,000 American women who served in uniform during World War II. These incredible women served in every service branch, in every combat theater, and in nearly 2/3 of the available military occupations at the time. I am so grateful this book sits on our shelves to offer a fresh lens to a time in American history I'm sure many of us thought we knew so well. Our conversation partner for the evening is prolific White House correspondent April Ryan. April has a unique vantage point as the only Black female reporter covering urban issues from the White House, a position she has held for over 26 years since the Clinton era. She is now the longest serving Black woman in the press corps. Her position as a White House correspondent has afforded her unusual insight into the racial sensitivities, issues, and attendant political struggles of our nation's past presidents. And now for our author of the evening, Lena Andrews. Lena is a military analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency. A native of Boston, she received her PhD. She received her PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, specializing in international relations and security studies. She has spent more than a decade in foreign policy, having previously worked at the RAND Corporation and United States Institute of Peace. Lena lives here in Washington, D.C. with her husband and son and is always looking for fresh takes on old stories. And now, please welcome our authors.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. All right, we can do better than that. It's summer. I've got my summer hair on. Good evening. Yes, some of you caught that. I am excited to be at East City Bookshop. I've never been here before, and it took Lena to bring me here. And it's such a wonderful occasion. Maybe I've been called prolific. I've been called a lot of names, but prolific. I love it. I love it, especially by who shall remain nameless. But anyway, okay, you just got that. Okay. This evening, we're going to have a wide-ranging, heartfelt conversation about patriotism that normally doesn't get the spotlight. Patriotism, right? Certain people have labeled patriots in certain ways, but we're going to expand your mind and your thinking about what patriotism looks like, especially in World War II, right? So Lena Andrews, it's a pleasure. It's an honor to be with you. Thank you for having me here to discuss this wonderful book, this wonderful read. If you don't have it, please go get it. Valiant Women. As you know, I am a proponent of women who run the world, girls. Beyonce was just here even in a storm, but it's all good. I'm serious. I believe in women. I believe we are underrated as we carry the load in so many avenues. And Lena, I just want to thank you for your persistence in shining a bright light, as Ida B. Wells would say, in dark spaces. Did you know 350,000 women were in the military units in World War II? So as we talk about patriotism, I asked my fiance, who is a retired naval officer, 25 years. Yeah, we are patriots too, very much so. I said, babe, what do you think about women in service in World War II? He said, nothing. I said, why did you say that? He said, because no one pays attention to it. That's an important point. And that's why this book is so important. And you took time during COVID, 10 years really, and during COVID to write this. Why?
Big question, of course. Well, first, let me say thank you to City Bookshop. When I first moved to DC, this was my home bookshop, which is why I was so eager to have it here. So thank you. It's a wonderful space where I've always felt welcome. And of course, thank you to the amazing April Ryan. I am both in awe of the fact that she is here, so pleased that she is here, and wondering why I chose the most amazing, effective, incredible questioner in DC to be the person who was interviewing me. But I am delighted.
I must.
I mean, literally, I think most people in this room are probably here for April, but I am delighted that you're here. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone here, of course. It means a great deal to see a full room of people who care about these women.
On a nice
DC night.
Nice DC night after storm. So
one of the few.
intentional.
Yeah, exactly. Clearly, I'm. We can draw a crowd at least. But thank you for being here. It means a great deal. I'm not someone who likes the spotlight, but any opportunity to shine more light, as you said, on these women is one I will take. So thank you. The question of why I wrote this book is sort of because I was called to it. It felt very much in some ways it was not something I had planned to do. I'll say that much. But a couple things happened all at once. The first is that I had become obsessed with support operations in the military, which is a weird thing to be obsessed with. I recognize some of my work colleagues probably understand that better than others, but I had done a dissertation on World War II and I was very focused on support operations. You probably are also focused on support operations, even though you may not know it, in the sense that if your FedEx package doesn't arrive, then you care. If your meeting gets rescheduled, then you care. So I think in some ways, support operations felt very universal to me. At the same time, I sort of discovered this little, it wasn't little at the time, but it was serendipitous for me. I arrived at the Military Women's Memorial in the National Mall, which if you haven't been, you should absolutely go to. It's right next to the Arlington National Cemetery, and stumbled on what then was a smaller exhibit and is now a large exhibit about women in World War II, and discovered that they were sitting exactly in those positions that I had just started to care so much about, support operations, and many other places as well. So it started to sort of get into my head as maybe there was something militarily interesting here. And then the final thing I'll say, and I think this speaks to the larger conversation about women and why they do things and how they get pushed into doing things that they might feel uncomfortable. I had a very good friend, she's here tonight, who said I should write this book. And that was enough. She gave me permission to do it. She said, it's going to be a really good book. And I think you're going to write it really well. And it's going to be very successful. And as a result of that little push and all of these other things happening, it felt, personally very powerful for me to do this. The last thing I'll say is that it's also just a story that I can't believe people don't know. It's too interesting and it's too important.
And that's an interesting piece, because you interviewed how many women?
6 living veterans and over, I think, 18, 20 families of veterans.
And what struck me is that there was a surprise in those that you interviewed that you were even concerned. That's sad.
Yeah,
That's
no,
it.
that's exactly right. And I think one of the things that I really, I hope that people take from the book, and I say this every time, is if you have the privilege of knowing a woman veteran of this war or of any war, please ask her story. You will not be disappointed by it. I certainly wasn't. I wrote a whole book about it. But I think what really motivated me is when I started to ask, and when I was able to ask women, why hadn't you shared their stories? I thought nobody was interested. And to me, that was heartbreaking and worth correcting.
So let's start with this, page 15, for those of you who have the book. Though the United States had previously fought many wars abroad, it had never waged multiple wars on multiple fronts in multiple parts of the world, near simultaneously and with a mountain of new technology, sophisticated equipment in tow. Together, these variables snowballed into a set of demands on logistics and support functions in World War II that were unmatched in the modern era. The American military would need to build, train, move, supply, and maintain a force of a size and sophistication that could sustain truly global combat operations. It would be a colossal undertaking. That's where we began.
And it is a colossal undertaking. I think people forget what total war means. And that means, and for those of you who are veterans or in the service now, you'll understand, it means that nobody gets to sit out. And that's both a great motivator, and also I think for people who are not sort of familiar with the history around this, can be very daunting. We had 16 million personnel who served in uniform in World War II. That's an extraordinary amount of population, and pretty much everyone else has a story of how they were either they're working in a manufacturing industry or filling in for men who were abroad. It touched everyone's lives, and it was one of the first wars where the actual stuff of war, the material of war, was really machine-based and mechanical and innovative in a way that we had not seen before. So those two things combined to just, Marshall, for instance, in his memoirs, is consumed with the issue of how they're going to get enough people. We need people to fight this war, and how are we going to find them? Because a plane is useless if there's no one to fly it, and that's where we find women.
Flying planes.
Yeah.
Flying planes, pilots and nurses, and what else?
They were everywhere. And I think this is what I really try and convey in the book. And hopefully for those of you who have read it, it comes through pretty clearly, which is to say, we sort of think of women in the 40s as being secretaries and teachers and social workers, which for the most part, that was a big part of what they did, both in the civilian industry, but also in the military. There were a lot of women who were secretaries in the military, but that is certainly not the totality of what they did. And they were truly everywhere. I think I have a list on the jacket. It's like, we felt very strongly about keeping it on there to demonstrate the breadth of the activities they were doing. I love the example of aviation because it's so important in World War II. It's really the first time that we see it deployed at such a large scale in combat. And if you look at sort of the arc of aviation, how a plane gets from one place to another, there are women at every spot. So there are women like Susan Ahn, one of my favorite characters in the book. She's training men how to fly planes. There are women like Anne Baumgartner in the book who are then ferrying planes around to make sure they're at the right bases at the right time. There are women like Jessie Contrabecki who's fixing planes to make sure they can be redeployed back to the Pacific. And in the field, there are other women who are, doing exactly these tasks, both in Europe and the Pacific. So for this critical thing that underwrites much of American strategy in both Europe and the Pacific, you can find women at every step of the way, and they're not just typists. Although typists are also very important. We should be clear about that. So it's there's
typists back in the day are like what we are at the computers at the keyboard now.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
Just so we know.
Everybody knows. Yeah.
Because some people, I'm telling you, don't remember a phone booth.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. There were, phone operators also. They're very important.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Used to be able to break in on a call.
Yeah.
Remember that?
I don't quite.
Yeah.
But
It's called the operator. Okay, okay. Anyway,
It's
moving
okay.
on.
Yes, of course.
But we're taking you back in time in different periods,
Yes.
but with the importance of women and the move afoot for women to be in these critical places, why were their roles so downplayed and not even talked about? These were major moments. I mean, the US military was one of the first to integrate racially, and then they put women in the forefront, pilots, etc., using the big machines, which is a big thing in services like that. But yet you don't hear about them. Why?
I mean, I don't know in some ways, I love these stories. But I think there are a couple things going on here. The first is, depends who you ask. So there are some people in this room who I've benefited from immensely who know these stories, and they've kept them alive, and they are most often women veterans themselves. And so I'm very indebted to that community who has helped me understand this history and keep it alive for generations, because most of the rest of us aren't paying attention. I think one of the things that's unique about the 40s, and particularly coming out of a cataclysmic event that I think a lot of people can understand coming out of COVID, is the desire to return to normal. And in 1945, what normal meant for most women was going from staffing a general one day to serving tea the next day back at home, in their role as a homemaker and a mother. And so they sort of got a signal that both either by force or by choice, they needed to go back to normal. And for a lot of them, that meant erasing this history, which is also why I think when I got the opportunity to talk to many of these women, they thought nobody cared because nobody had asked, because after the war, it was just back to the routine. Now, there were some very incredible women who pushed against that. And I'm glad they did, because I think we benefit immensely from their sort of foresight to say this history matters.
Chapter 25, To Make Men Free, you wrote something very prolific to me. The issue that so many people had with women in certain spaces. Let's talk about the Navy. The Navy had reason for their concerns. Sexual harassment was rampant abroad. And Navy leaders also worried about exposing the women to the extreme physical hardships of serving in the Pacific region. But the war for which the waves had been authorized turned out to be quite different, a quite different conflict in its closing days. Talk to me about the concerns of the Navy and other parts of the military as it related to bringing women into service, and comparing and contrasting yesterday to today. Are there still some of the same issues?
It's a fantastic question, of course. So look, I mean, I think it's a tricky thing in the sense that there were concerns. There were considerable concerns. Some of them were also well-founded in the sense that there were concerns about sexual assault and harassment, particularly overseas. A lot of them were overblown, and a lot of them were really twisted by the logic of the time, I think. So I tell a story in the book about how the heads of the women's services were really worried about image. This was the case with the Navy especially, but the Army also had this concern. And so they would really police what women were doing on the weekend. Were they drinking in public? Were they kissing a sailor? God forbid. Someone saw them doing something like that in public. And so they were really coming down hard on the women about their behavior. Now, at the same exact time, overseas, you have reports of commanders who would literally put the women who were deployed abroad under lock and key because they were worried about what would happen to them if they were alone or unescorted off base, because the men couldn't control themselves, or some sort of logic like this. They had to segregate evenings for movies and things like that. So at the same time that you have the women's leaders sort of hand-wringing about kissing in public, you have men's, the commanders of men's units literally preparing for violent felonies to occur. So that contrast is really striking to me. And I do think for me that resonated in a really troubling way with some of the conversations we have around those same issues today. That a lot of the onus is on the women to monitor their behavior and monitor what they're signaling in uniform, and less so on people who are men who share their uniform but are sort of expected in some way to do these horrible things. So that for me was a contrast that was really important to tease out, and it was a contrast that the leaders at the time were incredibly aware of, and like I said, quite frankly, just prepared for.
So women have proven who they've been on the field, in the air, in the hospital, everywhere in the military, but yet still find it hard to rise in the ranks today. still. Can you give me those rankings and those numbers as you have it?
Oh, no, no, please don't quiz me. What I can say is that we've come a long way. For those of you who follow the news, Admiral Franchetti was just nominated to be the first woman to serve permanently on the JCS, which is a huge, an incredible and inspiring thing for, I think, a lot of women in the services. Unfortunately, her promotion is on hold right now because of the politics of the day. But, you know, I do think that certainly the groundwork for all of that was laid in World War II. What's kind of striking is how long it's taken since then. You know, we had, you know, coming out of World War II, we had some very senior ranking women. They probably should have been higher ranked. So I'll just say one of my favorites, not favorite, that's the wrong word. One of the most impactful stories for me was Ovida Kalpabi, who runs the Women's Army Corps. She's responsible for 150,000 women, which for anyone in uniform knows is a pretty big size unit. She's a colonel, right? So that's too low. For those of you who don't know that, she should be much higher ranked than she is, which creates all of these bureaucratic problems because she's not in the room when they're making decisions about the unit that she is responsible for. So, you know, I do think there were many issues around rank and around how women were perceived. There was also a lot of progress in that space. But it's sort of, to me, what I think is most striking about where we've come today is that it's taken in some ways still a very long time for us to see women in those most senior echelons of the military.
So let's not just talk about women. Let's talk about Black women in the military. And for times such as this, we're seeing Black women saving the world. You know, I know, Black Women Save the World, an anthem. I might write a book about that. Yeah. But no, Black women. And then let's go into the LGBTQ plus community. Two communities that have been attacked, two communities that are just as much patriotic as anyone else, but yet still have to continue to prove themselves. Can you talk to me about those two categories, please, in the military?
Gladly. This was really important for me to be not just in the book in a sort of performative way, but really weaved through the book, because thousands of women of color served in uniform, many gay, lesbian, queer, you know, probably trans, although they may not have had the language at the time to identify that way. Women also served in the military. They did so as nobly, as valiantly, as honorably as anyone else. But there was they held a sort of tension, which I think is really, really important to acknowledge. And I try and acknowledge as best as I can in the book. I think one of the best examples of that is the 688 Central Postal Directory Battalion. Some of you are very familiar with that history here. I should probably invite you up to tell us all about it. But their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charity Adams, if you don't know her, look her up. She's an incredible person, and I believe will be being played by Kerry Washington in an upcoming Tyler Perry film. So if you don't read the book, you can watch the movie. And
isn't the movie being made in Atlanta?
I think so. Yeah, it must be, because a lot of his productions are there.
Yeah.
We're very excited. Oprah's on board. It's going to be great. It has to be. But more importantly, they just received the Congressional Gold Medal in large part due to the efforts of a group of incredible Black women veterans who've been lobbying for that for a very long time. But the reason I like to talk about them and about Charity Adams in particular is because the way in which they balanced this sort of the patriotism and the honor of their service with that tension of being in a segregated army is exceptional. And one of my favorite stories about it, and very inspirational, I should say, as a woman of color myself, reading this is hard, but it's also, I take many lessons from it in my own career. But my favorite story about Charity Adams, because I think it represents how she handled this tension so beautifully, is she's abroad. She's leading the 688. They're responsible for clearing an enormous backlog of mail in Europe. They do so beautifully, of course, and under budget and ahead of schedule. So she's a great commander. Everybody knows this. A white general comes over, reviews her troops for reasons that are not correct or meaningful in any substantive way, tells her that she's not doing her job very well, and in front of her unit says, I'm going to send a white lieutenant down here and show you how to do your job. Now, not only does Charity Adams massively outrank a lieutenant, but he's wrong. But here's what she says. She looks him in the eye and she says, over my dead body, sir. Which to me is the perfect, it's a great line, one, but it's also the perfect epitomization of this tension, of this reality in
I
which
still have to respect you as
Yes.
I challenge you.
and I have to challenge you also because I'm standing in front of my troops. My troops are looking to me. But the way that in that moment, she had the sort of presence of mind, I think about what I would have done in that. I probably would have melted into a puddle, but she had the presence of mind and the integrity to say, I will challenge you, but I will do so in a way that respects the institution that I also respect. And that to me feels like just such a poignant example of how these communities navigated a very, very difficult environment.
So lessons learned, were there any? Because we are still fighting the same battles today.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what are the lessons learned?
Well, I think for me as a person who sort of came to this later in my own research as someone who claimed to be an expert on World War II and then discovered this far too late, there is so much value in knowing our history and knowing all of it. And to me, a big part of this book is a corrective, and it was written very much for a generalist audience because I want everyone to understand that this is not just a story for the veterans community. It's not just a story for people like me who care a lot about military operations for various squirrely reasons, but it really is a story for everyone because it's our history and we need to acknowledge every part of that. And so as much as I'm, the reviews that matter most to me often come from those communities that have been carrying the story for so long. But I'm really hoping that it reaches a wider audience so people can really understand what all of our history looks like.
I want to give you a lot of praise and compliment you on highlighting this, because again, we need to put a bright light in dark spaces, especially in a time like this when they're trying to erase history, change history. Y'all already know where I'm going. Not just for Black people, but also in Florida. I just found out there's, what is that? The new Don't Say Gay law in education, where they're trying to change, taking issues in the LGBTQ plus community out of books. We're going through this now. So what do you say in this moment to future authors or people here who are inspired to write and tell this? Everyone and everything has a story. But what do you say to those people who want to put on paper or in some type of space where people can see the truth? What do you say?
Well, I'm so glad you brought up the sort of LGBTQ larger issues going on right now, because it's the perfect example, I think, of what I would say, which is you don't have to look very far to find the real history, which is to say in World War II, as I just mentioned, we like to think of sort of don't ask, don't tell as being the emergence of the issues around, gay and lesbian people serving, queer people serving in the military. We were dealing with this very openly, for the record, and very publicly in World War II and before. This is not something that is new, and I included in the book because it's—
And give that example, please.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, what I talked about total war earlier, and I think it's really important for people to understand that the military itself in World War II understood that as long as, and was pretty open about the fact that homosexuality, as they called it at the time, but really covered sort of anything that we would put under the umbrella now, they understood that it was happening, that it probably would continue to happen. And as long as it didn't really affect the morale of the group, they were basically willing to turn a blind eye, because it was total war, folks. It didn't quite matter in the same way. Now, if there were public or sort of problematic elements of it, from a PR perspective, then it did become a little bit more of a problem. And there are some horrific studies that I include in the book just to demonstrate how it could be personally very devastating for a lot of people. But at the same time, when you look back at the history, it's almost as complex and nuanced of a conversation as we are having today. I think we just have wiped that from our history because it's easier to say, well, this is a brand new issue, and so therefore we must, resolve it here on the Senate floor again, when in fact we were resolving it, in 1943 and 1944 and 1945 and in the 50s and the 60s. This has been ongoing, and we have a lot of history to learn from. So part of it for me, when I think about, people who are thinking about writing books or whatnot, is just to give light to these issues that I think we, as you so perfectly put it, to these issues that we sort of squirrel away, but also to be honest about them in the work. Because I think I've read a lot of books about World War II, and I know a lot of people who know this history about World War II and choose not to include it. And so I think for me, what was really important was to be honest about the realities of the time. And even if that was going to be uncomfortable to put on the page for some people.
Okay, I'm doing an unscientific poll right here. How many of you want to write a book? Raise your hand high. Be proud. Be loud about it. All right, there you go. Do it, please, because everyone has a story. And we need to learn from everyone, because we're in such a polarized moment. And I encourage everyone, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, live your best life and write your book. But I'm going to tell you, writing your book, it takes your life, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
10 years, yeah.
My husband can tell you.
Were you taking care of your son while she was writing a lot?
My hand did not go up.
Okay. So you could write a book about that. Okay. All right. But let's move into another piece, the mistreatment of women, the mistreatment of Black women, the mistreatment of those in the LGBTQ plus community, because they were not out. Many of them were not out at that time. They could not be. So talk to me about the mistreatment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure folks will have questions about this in the Q&A as well, but, it was really important for me, like I said, to be honest about the realities facing some of the historically marginalized groups, especially, in the queer community. So where there were investigations into it, like I said, they were personally devastating. But at the same time, I think for many, I like to talk about the fact that, well, mistreatment and sexual harassment and investigations were a part of the experiences for these groups. There was also a lot of, like I said, this tension between the honor, the patriotism, and the experience itself. So for many women, for instance, this was the first time that they had an opportunity to be outside of their small communities and get exposure to new ways and other ways of thinking, which I think is
save the country and the world.
Right? Exactly. Right. So there were so many benefits to military service in World War II that I also really try to highlight. So while yes, there are just sort of these really difficult experiences that I try and be honest about in the book around, largely around sexuality and sexual harassment and that sort of thing. I think it's important, especially to end on that, military service for women in World War II was often a ladder and a vehicle for progress. And so I wouldn't want anyone to walk away from this thinking that this is all a tragedy. In many ways, it is one of the most inspiring stories you'll ever read, because despite all of those things, these women came out of this war with new opportunities, with new friends, with new ways of thinking about the world, and we won. So great. There's lots of good outcomes to World War II. But I do want people to really understand that this is, as complicated as this history is, it is also a very uplifting one.
Very complicated, but yesterday is still today. Yeah. So at this point, we are going to go to questions, and I encourage you to raise your hand and say, I'm not going to be Oprah and run around, but we're going to encourage you to raise your hand and stand up and belt it out loudly so we can hear you. So who has a question? I came all the way from Baltimore. 2 hours. Yes, sir. Yes. Come. Yes. Hello. Welcome.
Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to hear about this, call it Hidden Figures. My question is, this calling that you had to write this book, a lot of times the undertaking that we take, they have a way of transforming us. So my question is, how did this labor of love transform you? And what is the greatest lesson learned that you share?
Come to the White House. Sit in the briefing. Yes.
Leave
Great
it to
question.
Clyde.
Someone said in the audience, great question. Yes, come.
Sure. Okay. Well,
Okay,
yeah.
repeat the question. Okay. How did this labor of love change her? Basically, a synopsis of a synopsis.
Excellent question. Thank you, Clyde. Well, did you hear me say I don't like talking about myself? No, it's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. I was, before this, a military analyst, and that's all I wanted to be, right? I didn't want people to see that I was a woman or a woman of color or, any of the sort of identity around me, because it was so important for me to be taken seriously on the merits of my ability to do military analysis, which if you're a civilian woman of color who's fairly young in the field, it's hard to get that sort of credit.
Oh, what does she know?
Exactly. exactly. And so a lot of my strategy was to erase that part of me and just go straight into that's in many ways why I wrote about what I did and I approached the issues that I did in the way that I did. What I always knew, and I think I gave myself permission in writing this book. You asked about how it transformed me. I think what transformed in my mind is that I am a better military analyst because I talk about those things now. And I understand the war in a way that I did not understand it before. And that is precisely because I took the lens of groups that have been historically marginalized in our histories. Now, I always knew that in my heart, but it took me a very long time to feel confident enough to actually say it out loud and to put pen to paper and defend it in front of people who might otherwise, dismiss that point of view. And so in that way, I think I've been very, very lucky and privileged. And I'm very great. I was already very grateful to these women for what they've done for the country and for me in my career. But what they've done for me personally is given me permission to be, my whole self in this industry, in this field. And for that, I'm extremely grateful.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that question. Thank you for that answer. To be your full self, to show up authentically. Question? Yes, ma'am. You have a virtual. Okay. Go. You really need to come to the White House. Follow up. Follow up. Yes, sir. Okay. What administration? That's the question. Over there. But with, yes, your follow up.
Oh,
Powerful lessons learned, but aside from what you mentioned earlier, is there anything else that you would like? What was the lesson learned that you would share with our society?
yeah, I mean, there are two things. One is one that I mentioned already, which is if you know a veteran, ask them their story, especially if they're a woman veteran, or especially if they're from a historically marginalized group. That has become my life's mission. Essentially, it's always been in some ways, being a civilian who studies the military, but I really think the yawning gap that we have between the civilian and military worlds in our country is increasingly becoming a major problem. So yeah, go ahead, April.
So I want to follow up on that follow up. In your opinion, after writing this book, what is patriotism to you?
Oh, that's a brutal one. Okay. I mean, to me, it is, the willingness to defend your country and your nation and your people against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That's the oath I took. And if you're willing to do that, then in my mind, you are a patriot. Now, I think we have a lot of work to do on understanding what an enemy really is. And I'm worried about how that definition is changing, especially as someone who studies, the greatest global conflict of all, of our living, or of our lives, of our parents' lives, because it was complicated then, but it was clearer than it is now. And I think there's been a lot of efforts, like you said, to rewrite that, and that really makes me nervous in a lot of ways. But I think the corrective to it is to talk to the people on the front lines, talk to the people who are fighting our wars, or going to be fighting our wars, because I think they have to have a very clear understanding of what that is. And, the further we get from that community, the less we understand what it's going to take, and what an enemy actually looks like. So I think that would be my biggest lesson learned, for sure. Now, Clyde, you're cut off.
Wow. Okay. We have a virtual
Yes.
question at this time.
So the question is, you mentioned the importance of asking the women we know who served in our armed forces to tell us their stories. Could you tell us how you found some of the women that you talk about in your book?
I love that question. Thank you, virtual audience member. I love it.
Does the audience member have a name?
Yeah. Jeffrey.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Terrific question. So here's the thing. I did all this research during COVID, most of the field work, as an academic would call it, but interviews during COVID, which could have been a real problem, and in many ways was, but for one thing, the people who were first getting COVID shots were generally over 100 or around 100. And local news outlets love to publicize a World War II veteran getting a COVID shot.
Oh.
So when you put an alert, on your Google. This is how research has changed. All the academics in the audience are going to be like, what? But when you put a Google News alert for World War II veteran in, like, say, I don't know, March of 2021, you get a lot of hits. And most of them are, World War II veteran gets COVID shot. And I would scan for women's names, and then I would reach out to the local media. And often, because they were these small organizations, small groups of people who were taking care of these veterans in their final days, it was actually pretty easy to find them. The other thing is, this was just totally serendipitous. Because of the timing, many of these women were turning 100. So that's the other thing that you get. I got a lot of hits on my Google search was, World War II veterans turns 100. Can you send her a card, or can you call her? And so that was incredibly serendipitous. And in one very, very special case, Vivian Millie Bailey, who features prominently in the book, is she passed away a couple of years ago, is one of my favorite interviewees. She just went skydiving when she was 102. So there was a lot of press around her.
Skydiving.
Was she 100? I can't remember if she was 102 or 100. But she was one of my favorites, not just for that, but if you can imagine the type of woman who's willing to do that at a, Centurion who's willing to jump out of a plane, she was amazing, and she got a lot of good press for that. But I think some of the more amazing things she actually did earlier. So yeah, it was a great question. Thank you for asking.
So this actually took your time, so you couldn't really focus on COVID, but you delved into something to distract you from all the lockdown and everything. Okay, I got it. So yes.
Today, there are a lot of debates around military, politically, especially Putin, and Lena, in your research and writing this book, what do you think is really wrong in the military or war capacity way to met our democracy then? What are these debates around
And that inclusion issue is a big deal. And I'm going to preface this before you say something. When we talk about inclusion, we're in a slippery slope now, especially after the affirmative action ruling on admissions. The Department of Justice and Department of Education are working on guidance. It is about the Supreme Court decision is about education, not about business. And we're seeing it, the slippery slope, having tentacles in almost every facet of life. So I added that to your question to help give a little bit more texture. Yeah.
And I think we should be conscious of it in the military context as well. I think, so thank you, Tim, for the excellent question and your longstanding friendship. But he's known me since. Oh, of course. Yeah. He was wondering about how the conversation about inclusive military then is, translates to today, and what women serving sort of how that has impacted the democratic ideals of the country. And this terrible summary of your question, but I did my best. So here, this is how I'll give you how I answer it for, like PR, and then I'll give you how I answer it as Lena, because Tim asked it. So both are true. One's just a little more polished. So I usually say, don't ask me about inclusion. Ask General George Marshall, ask Hap Arnold, ask, Dwight Eisenhower, who are some of the biggest skeptics of women serving in World War II. They did not see the need for women serving in World War II. They thought they would be a liability in some ways and not worth the effort. By the end of the war, these are exactly the men who are the loudest and strongest proponents of integrating women into the armed forces. Eisenhower, in fact, comes out of his retirement to testify on behalf of women being integrated into the military on a permanent basis. So you don't have to ask me about whether or not inclusion and diversity makes a better military. You can ask them. They knew it, and they learned it through exposure to the women who served. So I think, to me, that is the best evidence for why we should why we should sort of trust our commanders. They know what they need, and they won the war. So if it was good enough for them, it's good enough for me. I think my broader answer as sort of Lena, a person, is that, as I just mentioned, when we excise full groups of people from our history, we don't understand our history. And I think that the more that we exclude people from communities, whether it is, by de facto or de jure, is that the right term? I don't know. I think we get into really slippery territory about, knowing our full selves as a country. And so that to me is one of the most important things about understanding this history and really acknowledging women's service, is to say it's at the center. It's not at the periphery, because women were at the center. So I do think, for me personally, that's just a really big part of this as well.
Great answer. Yes, next question. And Tim, there was a question behind Tim. Okay, I see a question. Yes, there you go. Speak loudly, please, sir.
Mm. Yeah, it's a great question. And to repeat for the virtual folks, how can we bridge this gap, I think, between the military and civilian worlds, especially when I think you're right. There is a tradition of not talking about service, because there's a tradition of you don't do it for the credit, right? You do it because you're a patriot, and that's what you do. So it's a
That's
great
communications issue too.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, we're in the midst of one of the greatest recruiting crises for the military in decades. And so I think there is a reconsideration of how to message what military service sort of is and can be for many people. And I think, especially among young Americans, I hope that message gets through, because I really do think there's so much value in it. To answer your question, I think a lot of the onus is on the civilian population, and I take that very seriously. Obviously, it's something I've taken very seriously my whole life. But you don't have to look very far. Also, I think most of us, if we think really hard, know a veteran already, and have just not talked about it because maybe we're uncomfortable. We don't know what the right terms are, or if we're going to offend them. I've heard some really bizarre questions from civilians talking to vets. But also, I do think there is a time and a place for people like me to also, part of what the real joy about this for me was I'm not in the military, so I can brag about these women. They won't do it themselves, even when asked and pushed really hard. So I think as for those of you who have sort of an interest in this topic, and feel comfortable doing it, be a messenger for the incredible work that they did. Pump them up in some ways, because that to me has been one of the great joys of this, is being able to talk about the story so openly, so sort of in a way that's maybe over the top at times, because it is incredible. It is extraordinary. That word was picked very explicitly for the subtitle. It was extraordinary what they did. And so I think for those of you who, it's not just asking veterans what they did, but knowing their stories, sharing their stories, and celebrating their stories, that onus is on us. And if you're not doing it, then we're failing that community.
These are very good questions. Oh, we have one last question. How many hands were? Oh my goodness! Now you just put your hand up, sir. All right. Let me see. Here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna combine 2 and 1. Make it short and fast. Okay, the gentleman in the back, someone in the back has their hand up, and then we're gonna do the. Wait a minute, I'm coming to you. Hold on. Someone in the back. Yes, yes. Someone in the back. Yes, yes, ma'am. Yeah. I thought it was. All right, we are running out of time. I want to get the next one, but thank you, ma'am. Thank you. She's gonna get it. She's gonna, okay, hold on to that one. I'm gonna get the, yes, and then we're gonna hurry up fast. Question. Okay, all right, great. There we go. 2 questions in one.
That last one I'm going to skip because it was from my brother.
You set me up.
Come on, he looks like me. The question in the back about the memorials is a fantastic one, and I do think the conversation about memorials in this country has gotten way off the rails. I don't know what is happening anymore, and in large part because I am a person who loves history, and that means all of our history, good, bad, and ugly, which means we have to talk about those things. We have to understand why we valorize some parts of it. And at the same time, I think it's, we've gotten on both sides of the equation into a really funny conversation about what is worth sort of honoring and how, the expectation around that, I think, is really complicated. I don't have a good answer to it, but I think it's an excellent question. I love the Military Women's Memorial. I wish there were 100 of them. I wish they were in every city, and I wish there were also just women on memorial walls more often. It's not, I think there's a element of sort of putting this history into a separate little box that's not integrated into the larger military history, which is important because we have to have those spaces. That matters. But I also want to see them more well integrated into the larger narratives about memorializing military service. So I both love the memorial and I want so much more of it. What's next, PJ? I'm not quite sure. We'll see. We'll see what story strikes me, and maybe we'll all be back here in 3 years after another global pandemic. I hope not.
Oh, please don't say that. Please don't say that.
I'm just jinxing us all, but thank you.
Yeah,
We'll
you
see.
just did. Everyone, thank you. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for listening. Let's give Lena a big round of applause, not just for tonight, but for this magnificent book, putting a bright light in a dark space that we didn't talk about or know about. I've learned so much more from you and finding a lot about these centenarians who were trailblazers in World War II, and no one was talking about it. Thank you, Lena Andrews. Let's make this a New York Times bestseller. Buy it. It's an early Christmas present. Buy bulk. Buy in bulk. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. And thank you so much to April and Lena for an incredible conversation. Thank you to our audience in person and virtual. And so now we're going to transition to our signing line. We love that we have a packed house. So a couple of quick logistics on that. If you'd like to purchase a copy, we still have some copies up at the register.